The colony ship Horizon's Dawn was carrying 15,000 people across space to reach a new planet called New Terra and build a new home there. But something went terribly wrong when the antimatter containment system failed just 3 days before they were supposed to enter the planet's orbit, and the ship started breaking apart in the darkness of space. 10-year-old Danny Carter would never forget that terrible day when the alarm started screaming throughout the ship, and people were running and crying everywhere, and the whole ship was shaking like it was being torn apart by giant invisible hands, and his parents grabbed him and pushed him into an escape pod, even though he was screaming and begging them to come with him. But his mother just kissed his forehead one last time with tears streaming down her face, and his father sealed the hatch, and then Danny was alone in the small pod shooting away from the dying ship into the black void of space. The escape pod crashed hard into the surface of New Terra, and Danny woke up surrounded by the wreckage in a forest filled with enormous trees that had purple bark, and their branches created such a thick canopy above that only small beams of orange sunlight could push through to reach the ground below. And when Danny finally managed to crawl out of the broken pod, he had nothing except the clothes he was wearing and a small survival pack that had been strapped to the seat, and inside the pack, he found water purification tablets and some nutrient bars and a small medical kit and a thermal blanket and a knife. And most importantly, an emergency beacon that was blinking steadily, promising that someone might come to rescue him someday. Danny wandered through the alien forest for 3 whole days trying to figure out which direction to go and what to do. And he survived by drinking water from streams after treating it with the tablets and eating the tasteless nutrient bars while watching strange creatures move through the trees around him. And there were insects as big as his hand that glowed with soft blue light floating through the air like tiny lanterns, and he could hear calls and cries from animals hidden in the darkness between the massive tree trunks, but he never saw what was making those sounds, and he was too scared to go looking for them. On the 4th day of wandering alone through the purple forest, Danny heard something that made him stop walking, and his heart started beating faster because someone or something was screaming, and even though the sound was not human and was higher pitched than any person could make, the fear and pain in that scream was something Danny understood completely, because fear sounds the same no matter what language you speak or what planet you come from. Danny's hands were shaking as he pushed through thick plants that looked like giant ferns and followed the terrible screaming sounds until he came to a small clearing where the orange sunlight was streaming down through a gap in the canopy, and there in the middle of the clearing he saw her, and she was like nothing Danny had ever seen before in his entire life. She was pinned under a massive tree branch that must have fallen during a storm, and she was small, maybe 4 feet tall, with skin that seemed to shimmer and change color between silver and pale blue, depending on how the light hit her, and her eyes were huge and purple like precious stones, and she had 4 arms instead of 2. And right now all 4 of those arms were trying desperately to push the heavy branch off her body, but she was not strong enough, and her legs were trapped underneath and bent at angles that made Danny feel sick to his stomach. When their eyes met across the clearing, she went completely still and stopped struggling, and Danny could see his own fear reflected in those strange purple eyes. And for a long moment neither of them moved at all, and they just stared at each other, and Danny realized that she was probably just as scared of him as he was of her, because they were both alien to each other, and both alone, and both frightened. Then the girl made a sound like wind chimes being blown in a gentle breeze, but her breathing was fast and wrong, and Danny could see that she was in terrible pain. And something inside him made a decision before his brain could really think about it, and he walked toward her even though his legs felt like they might give out from fear at any moment. The branch was incredibly heavy, and when Danny tried to lift it the first time, he fell backward onto the ground, and his arms felt like they were on fire from the effort. And the girl watched him with those enormous eyes, and her breathing was getting faster and more shallow, and Danny knew he had to think of something quickly or she might die right there in front of him. His father had been an engineer on the colony ship, and his mother had been a biologist, and they had both taught Danny to look at problems carefully and find solutions by using his brain instead of just his muscles. And so Danny looked around the clearing until he found a strong straight branch lying on the ground, and he dragged it over to where the girl was trapped. And he found a large rock nearby, and he used the rock as a fulcrum point and wedged his branch underneath the heavy branch that was crushing the girl. Danny threw all his weight onto his makeshift lever and whispered, "Please work, please work, please work." And slowly the massive branch began to shift just a tiny bit, and then a little more, and the girl's eyes went even wider, and she made that wind. Chime sound again and started pulling herself backward, using her forearms to drag her broken body across the ground and away from the trap. Danny's whole body was shaking and sweat was pouring down his face and his muscles were screaming at him to stop. But he kept pushing down on the lever with everything he had, and the girl kept pulling herself backward inch by painful inch until, finally she was free, and Danny let go and the branch crashed back down to the ground with a boom that echoed through the forest. Danny collapsed on the ground next to his lever, breathing so hard he thought his lungs might burst, and the girl lay a few feet away also breathing hard, and Danny could see that her injuries were very bad because her lower legs were definitely broken and bent wrong, and one of her forearms was hanging limp and useless. She watched him as he slowly crawled toward her and he could see fear and confusion on her face, but he held up both his hands with his palms facing her, hoping that this gesture meant peace on her world the same way it did on Earth. And he said, very softly, "I will not hurt you, I promise. I just want to help," even though he knew she could not understand his words. Danny opened his survival pack and pulled out the emergency medical foam that was designed to stabilize broken bones and injuries until proper medical help could arrive, and his hands were shaking as he moved closer to her damaged legs. And the girl went very tense, but she did not try to pull away, and maybe she understood that he was trying to help, or maybe she was just too weak and hurt to fight anymore. He worked as carefully as he could, applying the white foam to her broken legs, and it expanded and hardened, creating temporary splints to hold the bones in place. And the girl made small sounds of pain, but she stayed still and watched his face, the whole time with an intensity that made Danny feel like she was seeing right into his soul. And when he finished with her legs, he did the same thing for her broken arm. Then Danny pulled out his water flask and held it out to her, and she stared at it for a long time before reaching out with one of her good hands, and her fingers had too many joints and ended in nails that looked almost like crystal. But she took the flask very gently and brought it to her mouth and drank deeply, and when she was done she made that soft wind chime sound again and touched her chest with one hand and then pointed at Danny. Danny understood what she meant, so he touched his own chest and said clearly, "Danny," and she copied his gesture and pointed at herself and said something that sounded like Lyra, and it came out like a song, and that was how Danny Carter met the alien girl who would change his life forever. Lyra could not walk, and that became very clear when Danny tried to help her stand up, because her legs would not support any weight at all, and every time she tried to put pressure on them, her face would twist with pain, and Danny felt his heart ache seeing her suffer like that. The orange sun was getting lower in the sky and the forest was starting to grow darker, and Danny had read enough survival books and guides back on the ship to know that being caught out in an alien wilderness at night was probably one of the worst ideas possible. And he looked around the clearing trying to figure out what to do, because he could not just leave Lyra here alone and injured. His eyes landed on a massive tree at the edge of the clearing, and near the bottom of its trunk there was a hollow space that was partially hidden by vines that hung down like curtains, and it was not much, but it would give them some shelter from whatever might be moving through the forest once darkness fell completely. Getting Lyra to that hollow was going to be a challenge because she was injured and could not walk, and Danny was just a 10-year-old boy who was not very strong. But he had to try, so he started looking around for materials and found some sturdy branches and vines, and he began working on building a simple travois like the ones he had seen in history books about ancient Earth. Lyra watched everything he did with those bright purple eyes, and sometimes she would make soft chiming sounds, and Danny could not tell if she was encouraging him or commenting on his work, or maybe even laughing at how clumsy he was, but he kept working until he had created a crude stretcher made from branches lashed together with vines and padded with broad leaves. Moving Lyra onto the travois was difficult, and Danny tried to be as gentle as possible, but he knew he was probably hurting her, and every small sound of pain she made felt like a knife in his chest. But finally, he got her settled on the makeshift stretcher and began dragging it slowly across the clearing toward the hollow tree. It was exhausting work, and Danny had to stop several times to rest because his arms and legs were burning from the effort, and sweat was pouring down his face, even though the air was getting cooler as the sun set. But eventually he managed to drag Lyra to the hollow and get her settled inside. The hollow was cramped and barely big enough for both of them, but it was dry and offered some protection from the elements and whatever predators might be hunting in the darkness. And Danny collapsed beside Lyra, breathing hard with every muscle in his body screaming in protest. As the darkness fell completely, The forest transformed into a different world, and sounds that Danny had not heard during the day began echoing through the trees, and there were deep hooting calls that came from somewhere high in the canopy, and something large was moving through the undergrowth, making the ferns rustle and sway. And then the bioluminescent creatures started coming out, and suddenly the darkness was filled with floating points of blue and green and purple light that drifted through the air like fallen stars. Danny pulled his thermal blanket from the survival pack, and even though it was designed for just one person, he spread it over both himself and Lyra, because she was shivering, and he figured they should share what little warmth they had. And Lyra made a questioning sound when he did this, but then she carefully moved two of her arms to help hold the blanket in place. They sat together in the darkness, listening to the strange sounds of the alien forest, and Danny had never felt more alone or more scared in his entire life, because he had lost his parents and his home, and everyone he had ever known. And now he was trapped on an alien planet with no idea if rescue would ever come. Then Lyra began to sing, and the sound was unlike anything Danny had ever heard in his life, because her voice could produce multiple notes at the same time, creating harmonies that should not have been possible from a single throat, and the melodies layered over each other, filling the small hollow with warmth and beauty. The song was sad and haunting and beautiful all at once, and Danny felt tears start sliding down his cheeks before he even realized he was crying, because something about that song spoke to the grief and fear and loneliness that was living in his heart, and even though he could not understand the words, he understood the emotion behind them. When Lyra finally stopped singing, the forest seemed quieter somehow, as if even the wild creatures had paused to listen to her voice. And Danny whispered, "Thank you," even though he knew she could not understand him. And then he felt Lyra's hand find his in the darkness, and her fingers wrapped gently around his, and they held hands like that, while the night deepened around them. Danny must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing he knew, the orange sun was rising, and light was filtering through the vines that covered the entrance to their hollow, and he could hear voices calling out in the forest, but they were not human voices, and instead they sounded like Lyra's wind chime tones, but more varied and urgent. Lyra was already awake and alert, and when she heard the voices, she stiffened and then began calling out in her own language, and her voice was loud and almost piercing in the small space, and the voices in the forest stopped for just a moment and then erupted in a flurry of rapid communication that was getting closer and closer. Danny's heart started pounding in his chest as figures began emerging from the morning mist, and there were 5 of them, and they were all similar to Lyra in their basic shape, but they were much taller and clearly adults, and they wore clothes made from woven fibers decorated with intricate patterns, and they carried staffs carved from the purple wood. And when they saw Danny sitting there next to Lyra, they all froze in their tracks. The largest of them was a male with skin that gleamed like polished silver, and he raised his staff in what looked like a defensive position, and his eyes narrowed as he took in the scene before him, which was his daughter, or maybe his niece, lying injured next to a strange alien creature that he had never seen before. Lyra started speaking rapidly in her language, gesturing with her good arms at Danny, and then at her splinted legs, and then at the white medical foam that was holding her broken bones in place. And the adults listened carefully, and Danny could see their expressions changing from hostility to confusion to something else that he could not quite identify. The silver-skinned male approached slowly and carefully, and Danny forced himself to sit perfectly still, even though every instinct in his body was screaming at him to run away as fast as he could. But he knew that running would be the worst possible thing he could do right now. The adult knelt down beside Lyra and examined her injuries with great care, and his 4 hands moved with practiced precision as he touched the medical foam and tested how rigid it was. And then he looked up at Danny with an expression that seemed to be dawning understanding. He spoke, and his voice was much deeper than Lyra's, but just as musical. And Danny shook his head helplessly and said, "I do not understand, and I am sorry, and I just wanted to help her." And even though the adult could not understand Danny's words, either something in his tone must have communicated his meaning. The adult studied Danny for a long moment, and then he placed one hand over his heart in a gesture that felt formal and important, and he spoke again. And this time his tone was completely different, and even though Danny still could not understand the words, he understood the emotion behind them, which was gratitude. 2 of the other adults moved forward and carefully lifted Lyra, supporting her weight with practiced ease, and she called out to Danny, reaching toward him with one of her good hands, and the silver-skinned male hesitated for just a moment, and then he gestured for Danny to follow them. Danny grabbed his survival pack and fell into step behind the group, and his mind was racing with questions about where they were taking him and what they were going to do with him, and whether he had just made the best decision or the worst decision of his life. But there was no turning back now. The group moved through the forest with a grace that made Danny feel clumsy and awkward by comparison, and they followed paths that Danny could not see, navigating around obstacles and through dense undergrowth, as if they had walked these routes 1,000 times before. After about an hour of walking, the forest began to change and the trees grew even larger, with trunks that were wider than the apartment Danny's family had lived in, back on the colony ship, and platforms started appearing among the branches connected by rope bridges, and structures made from woven branches and large leaves dotted the canopy, blending so seamlessly with the natural forest that Danny almost missed them at first. They had reached the village, and Danny's life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The adults watched Danny's interactions with the children with growing interest, and Cale in particular seemed fascinated by the way Danny approached problems differently than they did, because his human brain had been trained to think in ways that were alien to them, just as their ways of thinking were alien to him. One day, the village needed to move a massive log for a construction project, and all the adults gathered around it and coordinated their efforts, using their forearms and their greater numbers to try to lift and carry the enormous piece of wood. But even with many people working together, it was incredibly difficult and dangerous work. Danny watched for a while, and then he remembered the same technique he had used to save Lyra, and he found a long, sturdy branch and a large rock, and he showed the adults how to use a lever and fulcrum to move heavy objects with less effort and less risk. Cale had examined Danny's setup for a very long time, touching the lever and testing the fulcrum point and asking questions that Danny could not fully understand, but tried his best to answer with gestures and demonstrations, and then Cale taught the technique to the other workers, and soon they were using levers all over the village for various tasks. But not everything was easy or happy during those early days, and Danny still carried a deep grief for his parents, and sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night from terrible dreams about the ship exploding and his mother's face as she sealed the escape pod and his father's final wave goodbye. The emergency beacon in his survival pack continued its steady blinking day after day and night after night, but no rescue ever came, and Danny would sometimes sit alone in his dwelling and stare at that blinking light and wonder if he was the only survivor from the horizon's dawn, and if he was truly the last human being on this entire world. On those difficult nights when the loneliness threatened to swallow him whole, Lyra seemed to sense his sadness even from her dwelling across the village, and she would begin to sing, and her voice would carry through the quiet night and wrap around Danny like a warm blanket, and somehow that made him feel less alone. 3 weeks after Danny had rescued Lyra from beneath that fallen branch, she took her first steps, and it was a momentous occasion that brought tears to everyone's eyes, including Danny's and Selah's and even Kyle's, though he tried to hide them. Danny was there along with Selah and Cale and the healers, and they all gathered in Lyra's dwelling to watch as she stood up slowly and carefully with a staff to support her weight, and her legs that had been so terribly broken were now strong enough to hold her. She wobbled and swayed, and Danny held his breath, afraid she might fall. But Lyra was determined, and she took one step, and then another, and then another, until she had walked from one end of the dwelling to the other, and everyone erupted in cheers and made that beautiful wind chime sound that meant joy and celebration. Lyra looked directly at Danny and made a gesture that they had developed together over the past weeks, and it involved placing your hand over your heart and then extending it toward another person, and it meant thank you, and I see you, and I acknowledge what you have done for me. Danny returned the gesture, feeling tears burning in his eyes, though he was not entirely sure why he was crying, and maybe it was because he was happy for Lyra, or maybe it was because he finally felt like he belonged somewhere, or maybe it was both. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into a month, and Danny settled into the rhythms of village life, and he learned more of the language every day until he could have basic conversations with Lyra, and even with some of the adults and children. He helped with daily tasks like gathering fruit from the high branches, and tending to the vertical gardens and hauling water from the stream that ran through the forest below, and helping to prepare meals in the communal cooking areas, and every task he completed made him feel more like a real member of the community. The village children no longer saw him as strange or scary, and instead they saw him as one of them, and they would call his name from the rope bridges and invite him to play games and teach him songs in their language. And Danny taught them songs from Earth, including simple ones like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, which sounded absolutely beautiful when sung in their multi-tonal voices. Cale began teaching Danny the ways of the forest and how to read the signs that told you when a storm was coming, by watching how the canopy moved and how the insects behaved, and he taught Danny which plants were medicinal and which were poisonous, and how to move through the trees without disturbing the natural balance. Sela taught Danny about healing, and she showed him which herbs could reduce fever, and which could help bones knit together faster, and which could ease pain. And she taught him the songs that her people sang while they worked with medicine because they believed that intention and sound could help the healing process. One evening, as Danny sat with Lyra outside her dwelling, watching the bioluminescent insects begin their nightly dance through the air, she turned to him and spoke in careful English that she had been practicing. "You saved my life," she said. And the words were heavily accented and some of the sounds were not quite right, but Danny understood perfectly. "You are my friend," he replied in her language, and he was getting better at producing the multiple tones, though his voice could never achieve the full range of harmonics that hers could. Lyra reached out with one of her hands and took his hand, and they sat there together watching the lights drift through the purple forest, and for Danny, it was a moment of pure peace and contentment. But that peace was about to be disrupted in the most wonderful and terrifying way, because the next morning, Cale came to Danny's dwelling before the sun had fully risen, and the village leader was wearing ceremonial garments that Danny had never seen before, and his silver skin was painted with elaborate patterns that glowed softly with bioluminescent pigment. Cale's expression was serious and formal, and he gestured for Danny to follow him. And Danny felt his heart start to pound in his chest because he had no idea what was happening. But it was clearly something important. They walked through the still, sleeping village and climbed higher into the canopy than Danny had ever been allowed to go before, and the rope bridges at this level were narrower and swayed more in the early morning breeze, and Danny had to concentrate hard to keep his balance. Finally, they reached a platform near the very top of the tallest tree, and the first rays of orange sunlight were just beginning to break through the leaves, and Danny stepped onto the platform, and his breath caught in his throat. The entire village was gathered there, and every single adult and child and elder stood in a great circle around the platform's edge, and they were all watching him with expressions that ranged from solemn to joyful, and in the center of the circle stood Lyra, leaning on her staff but standing tall and proud, and beside her stood Sela. Cale led Danny to the center of the circle and positioned him beside Lyra, and then the village leader began to speak, and his voice carried clearly across the silent gathering, and he spoke for a long time, gesturing at Danny and at Lyra and at the forest spread out below them. Danny could not understand all the words, but he caught the rhythm of the story, and he heard his own name and Lyra's name, and he understood that Cale was telling everyone about the rescue, and about how a stranger had helped someone he did not know and had no obligation to help. When Cale finished speaking, Lyra stepped forward, and her movements were still careful, but there was strength and determination in every step, and she spoke in her clear voice, telling her own version of the story from her perspective. Then to Danny's complete shock, Lyra produced his survival knife from a fold in her garment, and he had not even realized it was missing, and she held it up for everyone to see, and then she placed it carefully back into Danny's hands. "Friend," she said in English, which was one of the few words she had fully mastered, and then she said a similar word in her own language that sounded like friend. The entire gathering responded with that wind chime sound, and it was a collective affirmation that rolled across the platform like a wave, and Danny felt goosebumps rise on his arms. Cale stepped forward again and pulled out a length of woven cord that had been dyed with intricate patterns in multiple colors, and he began tying it around Danny's wrist and speaking softly as he worked. And when he was finished, he pulled back his own sleeve to reveal an identical cord tied around his own wrist. Then Sela came forward, and she did something that absolutely shocked Danny because she knelt down in front of him, even though she was an adult, and he was just a child, and she spoke with her voice thick with emotion, and then she produced a small carving from her pouch. The carving was made from purple wood, and it was small enough to fit in Danny's palm, and it depicted two figures standing side by side, and one was clearly Lyra, and the other was clearly meant to be Danny, and Sela pressed this precious gift into Danny's hands. Then Sela pulled Danny into an embrace and her forearms wrapped around him completely, and something inside Danny broke loose, and he began to sob into her shoulder, and all the grief and fear and loneliness that he had been carrying for the past month came pouring out, and Sela held him tight and sang softly in his ear a lullaby in an alien tongue that somehow felt like home. The village was home to maybe 300 beings who were all like Lyra with their shimmering skin and forearms and large purple eyes, and as Danny was led through the settlement, all activity seemed to stop, and people emerged from their homes, gathering on platforms and rope bridges to stare at the strange alien child who had appeared in their forest. Danny had never felt more alone or more watched in his entire life, and he kept his eyes focused on Lyra, who was being carried ahead of him, and she kept looking back at him frequently, with an expression that seemed worried, as if she was concerned about what might happen to him now. The group brought Lyra to a large structure near the center of the village, and this building had open sides, and was filled with woven mats arranged in neat rows, and there were carefully organized bundles of dried plants hanging from the ceiling. And Danny realized this must be where the healers worked, because several older individuals immediately surrounded Lyra and began examining her injuries with their many hands moving quickly and competently. The silver-skinned male, who Danny was starting to think of as some kind of leader, gestured for Danny to sit on a mat near the entrance to the healing house, and then he spoke to several other adults who nodded and dispersed into the village to do whatever tasks he had given them. And then the leader sat down across from Danny and just studied him with those unsettling purple eyes that seemed to see right through him. They sat in silence for what felt like a very long time, and Danny could hear Lyra inside the healing house making small sounds of discomfort as the healers worked on her injuries, and every little cry of pain made Danny wince because he hated knowing that she was hurting. Eventually, the leader reached into a pouch that hung at his waist and pulled out a piece of fruit that looked like a strange cross between an apple and a flower with petals instead of skin, and he took a bite from it and then offered the rest to Danny. Danny's stomach growled loudly because he had not eaten anything since the previous morning, and he was starving, so he carefully took the fruit and bit into it, and the taste was sweet and slightly tangy with a texture that reminded him of firm pudding, and even though it was strange and alien, it was also surprisingly good. The leader made a sound that might have been approval, and then he pulled out more food from his pouch and shared a simple meal with Danny, and they sat there eating together in companionable silence, while the healers continued working on Lyra behind them. As the day wore on, more and more villagers came to see the strange visitor, and they gathered in small groups, keeping what they probably thought was a safe distance, and staring at Danny with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion to outright fear, and Danny tried his best to look harmless and non-threatening. The children were braver than their parents, and they crept closer and closer until they were almost within touching distance, and they stared at Danny's round ears, which were so different from their own, and at his hands, which only had 5 fingers, instead of the 6 fingers they had, and one particularly bold child reached out and touched Danny's hair, and then made a surprised chiming sound when it felt completely different from their own feather-like crests. Danny tried to smile at the children to show them he meant no harm, and some of them smiled back, and their expressions were surprisingly human, despite all their alien features, and for just a moment Danny felt a tiny bit less alone. As evening approached, the healers finally emerged from the healing house, and they spoke at length with the leader, demonstrating things with their hands and showing him how they had set Lyra's bones, and the leader's expression grew serious and then thoughtful, and he looked at Danny for a long moment before standing up and walking into the healing house. Danny waited outside, feeling his anxiety grow with every passing second and wondering what was going to happen to him now, and whether these people would let him stay or send him away or worse. And finally, after what felt like forever, the leader emerged and gestured for Danny to come inside. Lyra was lying on a sleeping mat, and her legs were properly set now and wrapped in splints made from treated wood and plant fiber that had been carefully shaped to support her broken bones, and her broken arm was similarly treated with professional-looking splints, and she looked exhausted but alert, and when she saw Danny, her whole face seemed to light up with joy. She spoke to her father or leader or whoever the silver-skinned male was, and her voice was weak but insistent, and he replied in their musical language, and then turned to Danny and gestured around the village and spoke at length in a tone that sounded formal and important, even though Danny could not understand a single word. Danny understood nothing except the final gesture, when the leader pointed at a small dwelling that was visible through the open wall of the healing house, and then pointed at Danny, and then made a staying motion with his hands that was clear in any language. Danny's eyes went wide with surprise, and he said, "You want me to stay here?" And even though the leader could not understand the words, he seemed to read Danny's expression correctly, and he nodded once firmly. Then the leader touched his own chest and said a single word that sounded like Kale, and Danny understood that this was his name. So Danny touched his own chest and said Danny as clearly as he could. Kale placed one of his hands on Danny's shoulder, and it was a gesture that felt like acceptance and welcome and belonging. And for the first time since the terrible day when the colony ship had exploded and his parents had died, Danny felt something other than fear and grief and despair. He felt hope growing in his chest like a tiny warm flame. The dwelling they gave Danny was small but surprisingly comfortable, and it was built among the lower branches of one of the massive trees, and it had a sleeping mat that was stuffed with something soft and fragrant, and there was a basin for washing and walls made from woven branches that let in light during the day, but would keep out rain and wind. Danny lay down on the sleeping mat that first night and stared up at the ceiling, and listened to the sounds of the village settling down for the night, and he heard parents calling their children inside, and he heard soft singing from various dwellings, and he heard the wind moving through the purple leaves of the great trees. He pulled out the small carving that his father had made for him years ago, and it was the only thing he had left from his old life, and it was a wooden bird that his father had carved during one of their family trips, and Danny held it tightly in his hand and whispered, "I miss you, Mom, and I miss you, Dad, and I wish you were here, but I think I'm going to be okay." Sleep came slowly that night, but when it finally arrived, Danny dreamed of purple forests and wind chime voices and four-armed children playing in the trees, and for the first time since the crash, his dreams were not nightmares. The next morning, Danny woke to orange sunlight streaming through the walls of his dwelling, and the sound of the village coming to life around him, and he stepped outside onto the small platform and saw Kale standing nearby, and the leader smiled at him and gestured for Danny to follow. They walked through the village together, and Kale showed Danny where to get water and where the communal cooking areas were and how to navigate the rope bridges safely, and Danny tried to absorb everything because this was his home now, and he needed to learn how to live here. The village operated on rhythms that Danny slowly began to understand, and people woke with the sunrise, which came early and orange through the purple canopy, and the adults went about their work, which included gathering food and hunting and crafting tools and tending to the vertical gardens that grew on platforms throughout the village. Danny visited Lyra every single day, and her dwelling was close to the healing house, and her mother was almost always there, and her name was Selah, and she had skin that shimmered like moonlight. And at first, Selah watched Danny with obvious wariness and suspicion, but as the days passed and Lyra's condition continued to improve, Selah's attitude toward Danny began to shift from wariness to grudging acceptance, and then slowly to something that felt almost like warmth. Lyra was an enthusiastic communicator despite being confined to her mat, and she and Danny worked together to develop a basic language using gestures and sounds and simple words, and she taught him words in her tongue and laughed with those beautiful wind chime sounds whenever he mispronounced something badly. Tree Danny would say while pointing at the purple bark, and Lyra would try to repeat it saying something like "tu-re," and they would both dissolve into giggles because it sounded so wrong coming from her multi-tonal voice box. The days passed, and slowly Danny began to feel less like a strange outsider, and more like someone who belonged in this place, and the village children, after their initial wariness, adopted Danny into their games, and they taught him how to climb the rope bridges without looking down, and how to identify which fruits were safe to eat, and how to move quietly through the canopy without making noise. Danny taught them games from Earth, including tag and hide and seek, and a simplified version of soccer that they played with a ball woven from vines and flexible branches, and the children picked up the rules quickly, and soon the sound of their laughter, both human and alien, was echoing through the village every afternoon. When Danny finally pulled back from Selah's embrace and wiped the tears from his face, he saw that the entire gathering had their hands pressed to their chests, and then they all opened their arms toward him in a gesture that was clearly ceremonial and deeply meaningful. Kale spoke again, and even though Danny still could not understand every word, he understood the tone and the intention behind those words, and the message was clear and simple and profound, which was, "You are one of us now, and you are family, and you belong here." The orange sun crested above the canopy and bathed the entire platform in warm golden light, and the villagers began to sing, and their voices layered into harmonies so complex and beautiful that Danny could barely breathe, and the sound seemed to fill the entire forest and maybe even the whole world. Lyra took Danny's hand with one of hers and squeezed gently, and they stood together in the center of that incredible song, and they were two children who had found each other in the darkness, and who had somehow become family. The ceremony continued, for what felt like hours, with different villagers coming forward to present Danny with small gifts and tokens of acceptance, and there were carved figures and woven bracelets and small pouches of special herbs, and each gift came with words that Danny was slowly beginning to understand. When the ceremony finally ended, the entire village descended from the high platform, and there was a feast waiting below with tables laden with fruit and roasted meat, and dishes made from vegetables Danny had never seen before, and everyone ate and drank and celebrated. Children ran between the tables playing games and laughing, and the adults sat in groups talking and singing, and Danny found himself surrounded by people who wanted to talk with him and practice their few words of English, while he practiced his growing vocabulary in their language. As the day wore on, Danny realized that something fundamental had changed, and he was no longer the strange alien boy who had fallen from the sky. And now, he was something more, and he was becoming part of the community, and part of the tribe. That night Danny lay in his dwelling holding the small carving that Sela had given him, and looking at the woven cord around his wrist that matched Kale's, and he felt a sense of belonging that he had not felt since before the colony ship exploded. The seasons began to change on New Terra, and Danny learned to read the signs that marked the passage of time in this new world. And there was a season when the purple leaves turned silver and fell from the trees, and a season when new growth emerged, in brilliant shades of blue and green, and a season when the rains came heavy and constant and turned the forest floor into a maze of streams and puddles. Through all these changes, Danny continued to grow and learn and adapt, and he became fluent in the village language, and he could climb the rope bridges as easily as any child born here, and he knew which paths through the forest were safe and which were dangerous. Kale formally adopted Danny in another ceremony, and from that day forward Danny was considered Kale's son in the eyes of the entire village, and this meant he had responsibilities as well as privileges, and Kale began teaching him the skills that a leader needed to know. Danny learned how to mediate disputes between villagers and how to make decisions that were best for the community, even when they were difficult, and how to read people's emotions and intentions from their body language and tone. Lyra recovered completely from her injuries, and soon she was climbing and running and playing just like before, except now she had a constant companion in Danny, and the two of them were inseparable, and the village began referring to them as brother and sister, even though they came from different worlds. Danny introduced innovations to the village that changed how they did many things, and using principles that his engineer father had taught him, he helped design better tools and more efficient systems for watering the vertical gardens and structures that could better withstand the fierce storms that occasionally tore through the forest. The villagers in turn taught Danny their deep understanding of how to work with living things rather than against them, and they showed him how to encourage plants to grow in specific patterns and how to breed the bioluminescent insects to produce different colors of light and how to live in harmony with the forest ecosystem. When Danny was 12 years old, a group of young hunters invited him to join them on an expedition into the deep forest, and this was a significant honor because it meant they considered him skilled enough and trustworthy enough to participate in one of the most important activities of village life. The hunt lasted for 3 days, and Danny learned how to track prey through the undergrowth, and how to move silently through the trees, and how to work as part of a coordinated team. And when they returned to the village with their kills, Danny felt a surge of pride because he had contributed something valuable to his community. Lyra also continued to grow and develop, and she showed an exceptional talent for healing like her mother. And Sela began training her in the complex arts of medicine, and Danny would often sit with them while they worked, learning about the properties of various plants and how to treat different injuries and illnesses. The emergency beacon in Danny's survival pack finally died when he was 13 years old, and the light that had blinked steadily for 3 years faded to nothing, and Danny buried the dead beacon under the tree where his dwelling stood, and he said a quiet goodbye to his old life and his old hopes of rescue. He realized that he no longer wanted to be rescued because this was his home now, And these were his people, and he could not imagine leaving them, even if a human ship suddenly appeared in the sky. By the time Danny was 14, he stood as tall as many of the adult villagers, and his body had grown strong from years of climbing and working and living in the forest, and the village no longer saw him as Kale's adopted son, who happened to be human, but simply as Kale's son. New children were born in the village, and they grew up with stories about Danny and how he had saved Lyra and shown them that compassion could cross the void between different species. And these children learned both languages from birth and sang songs in both human and native styles and played games that blended traditions from two different worlds. Danny taught classes to the young children, showing them basic mathematics and science concepts from Earth, while the native teachers taught him and the other students about the philosophy and history and art of their people, and this exchange of knowledge enriched everyone. On quiet evenings, Danny would sometimes climb to the highest platform in the village and look up at the stars scattered across the alien sky, and he would wonder if humanity still existed somewhere out there, and if other colony ships had succeeded where the horizon's dawn had failed. Lyra always found him during these moments, and she would climb up to sit beside him, and they would talk about everything and nothing, using whichever language felt right for the particular thought they were trying to express. "What are you thinking about?" she asked him one evening, and they were speaking English because they often used his language when they were alone together. "I am thinking about how strange fate is," Danny replied, "and how everything had to go wrong in exactly the right way for me to end up here with you." "The threads of fate," Lyra said, switching to her own language because this particular concept only made sense in her tongue, "and they brought you to us when we needed you and when you needed us." Danny nodded because she was right, and he had lost absolutely everything in that crash, and his parents were gone, and his species' dream of colonizing New Terra was gone, and the entire life he was supposed to have was gone. But in losing everything, he had found something he never expected. He had found a family that chose him, and a sister who understood him, and a home that welcomed him, despite every difference, and a purpose that went beyond simple survival. The village continued to thrive and grow, and the platforms expanded further into the canopy, and the population increased as new children were born. And the integration of human and native knowledge led to innovations that benefited everyone. Danny became known as a bridge between ways of thinking, and people would come to him when they faced problems that seemed unsolvable, because he had a unique perspective that combined human analytical thinking with native intuitive understanding. When Danny was 15, Kale began including him in the council meetings where the village elders made important decisions about trade with other villages and resource management and long-term planning, and Danny's input was valued and respected. He proposed ideas like establishing a system for teaching both languages to all children, and creating detailed maps of the surrounding forest, and developing better methods for preserving food during the abundant seasons, so there would be enough during the lean times. The council elders listened to Danny's ideas with interest and respect, and many of his proposals were adopted and implemented throughout the village, and this made Danny feel valued and useful, and like he was truly making a difference in his adopted home. Lyra continued to develop her skills as a healer, and by the time she was 15, she was assisting her mother with complex medical procedures and treating patients on her own, and she had a natural gift for understanding how bodies worked and how to fix them when they were broken. Danny and Lyra worked together on a project to document all the medicinal plants in the surrounding forest, and they created a comprehensive guide that included descriptions and drawings and notes about which parts of each plant were useful and how to prepare them and what conditions they could treat. This guide became an invaluable resource for the village healers, and eventually copies were made and shared with other villages in the region, and Danny felt proud that he and Lyra had created something that would help people long after they were gone. The relationship between Danny and the village deepened with each passing season, and he participated in all the important ceremonies and festivals, and he learned the traditional dances, even though his 2 arms made some of the movements difficult compared to the natives with their 4 arms. He also taught the villagers about Earth holidays and traditions, and they celebrated a version of his birthday every year, and they learned about concepts like New Year and harvest festivals, and they incorporated some of these ideas into their own cultural practices, creating something entirely new and unique. When Danny was 16, a delegation arrived from another village that was located several days' journey to the east, and they had heard stories about the human who lived among Kale's people, and they wanted to see this strange being for themselves. Danny was nervous about meeting these strangers because he worried they might be hostile or afraid of him. But Kale assured him that the other village was friendly and had sent word ahead that they came in peace and wanted to establish better trade relations. The delegation consisted of 5 adults, including their leader, who was a female with skin that shimmered like copper, and she introduced herself as Mira, and she studied Danny with intense curiosity, but not hostility. Through Kale's translation, and Danny's own growing language skills, he learned that Mira's village had been suffering from a disease that affected their crops, and they had heard that Danny had knowledge of plant care and cultivation techniques that might help them. Danny spent several days with the delegation examining samples of their affected plants and asking questions about their growing methods and soil conditions and water sources, and he realized that the problem was likely caused by a fungal infection that was spreading through their gardens. He explained through Kale how to identify and remove infected plants before the fungus could spread, and how to improve air circulation around their gardens, and how to treat the soil with certain compounds that would make it less hospitable to the fungus. Mira was grateful for this information, and before the delegation left, she presented Danny with a gift, which was a beautifully woven cloak decorated with patterns that told the story of her village, and she said that Danny would always be welcome in her land. After the delegation departed, Kale told Danny that word of his knowledge and helpfulness would spread to other villages, and that this would strengthen their community's position in the region, and Danny realized that his human knowledge combined with his adopted culture's wisdom was creating opportunities that neither could have achieved alone. As Danny approached his 17th birthday, he had grown into a tall young man who stood eye to eye with Kale, and his body was lean and strong from years of physical work, and his skin had been darkened by the orange sun to a deep bronze color. His hair had grown long, and he wore it tied back in the style of the village hunters, and the woven cord that Kale had given him during the adoption ceremony was still tied around his wrist, though it was now faded and worn from years of wear. Lyra had also grown into a capable and confident young woman, and she was now considered a full healer in her own right, and people from across the village and even from neighboring settlements would come to seek her help with their ailments. The bond between Danny and Lyra remained as strong as ever, and they were still inseparable, and they could communicate with each other using just glances and small gestures, and they often knew what the other was thinking without needing to speak. One evening, as they sat together on a high platform watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple and red, Lyra turned to Danny and said something that had been on her mind for a long time. "Do you ever regret staying here?" she asked in English because she wanted to make sure he understood exactly what she was asking. "And do you ever wish the rescue ship had come to take you back to your own people?" Danny was quiet for a long moment, thinking about his answer, because he wanted to be truthful, and he looked out at the forest that had become his home, and at the village platforms scattered through the trees, and at the people moving about below who had become his family. "No," he said finally, "and I do not regret it, because this is where I belong and you are my people now, and I cannot imagine being anywhere else." Lyra smiled and took his hand, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching as the bioluminescent insects began their nightly dance through the darkening air. The village continued to evolve and grow, and the integration of human and native knowledge had created a culture that was richer and more diverse than either could have been alone, and children grew up speaking both languages fluently and learning from both traditions and seeing no contradiction between them. Danny worked with the village craftspeople to develop new tools and techniques, and he showed them how to create more efficient pulleys and how to use gears to multiply force and how to design structures that distributed weight more evenly. In return, the craftspeople taught him their methods of working with living wood, and how to encourage trees to grow in specific shapes, and how to weave materials so tightly that they became waterproof without needing any additional coating. The vertical gardens that sustained the village became more productive than ever, thanks to the combination of Danny's understanding of agriculture and soil science with the natives' intuitive knowledge of how plants responded to different conditions and care. Trade with other villages increased as word spread about the innovations coming from Kale's settlement, and delegations arrived regularly, bringing goods to exchange and hoping to learn some of the new techniques that were being developed. Kale grew older, and his silver skin began to show faint patterns that indicated age and wisdom, and he started talking to Danny more seriously about leadership and responsibility, and what it would mean to eventually take over as village leader. Danny was both honored and terrified by this prospect, because leading people was an enormous responsibility, and he worried that some villagers might never fully accept a human as their leader. But Kale assured him that his actions over the years had earned him the respect and trust of the community. "You saved my daughter," Kale said one day as they sat together working on a complicated engineering problem, but that was only the beginning. And since then, you have saved us in many other ways by sharing your knowledge and your perspective and your compassion. You showed us that differences can be strengths rather than weaknesses. Kale continued, and that wisdom can come from unexpected places, and the village is better because you are part of it. Danny felt tears prick his eyes at these words because acceptance and belonging were things he had once thought he would never feel again after losing everything in the crash. Meanwhile, Lyra was making her own mark on the community, and she had developed several new treatments for common ailments, and she had established a training program for young people who wanted to become healers, and her reputation was growing throughout the region. Other villages began sending their aspiring healers to study with Lyra and learn her methods, and this created new connections and relationships between communities that had previously had little contact with each other. Danny and Lyra together represented something entirely new in this world, and they were proof that different species could not only coexist, but could thrive together and create something beautiful and meaningful from their collaboration. On the anniversary of the day Danny had saved Lyra, they would always spend time together reflecting on how far they had come, and how much their lives had changed, and how grateful they were for the twist of fate that had brought them together. Sometimes Danny would think about the other people who had been on the horizon's dawn, and wonder if any of them had survived, and if there were other humans somewhere on New Terra trying to build new lives, and he hoped that if there were, they had found communities as welcoming as his own. But mostly Danny thought about the present and the future rather than the past, and he thought about all the work that still needed to be done, and all the ways he could continue to help his village thrive and grow. He thought about the children who would grow up in this blended culture, and the innovations they would create and the bridges they would build, and he felt hopeful about what the future might hold for this small corner of New Terra, where two worlds had learned to become one. When Danny turned 18, the village held another ceremony, but this one was different from the adoption ceremony years before, and this time they were marking his transition into full adulthood, according to the traditions of Lyra's people. The ceremony involved tests of skill and knowledge and endurance, and Danny had to demonstrate his abilities in hunting and crafting and problem-solving and leadership, and he also had to recite the history of the village going back 7 generations, which he had memorized over the past year. Kyle watched with obvious pride as Danny completed each challenge successfully, and when the final test was finished and Danny stood before the gathered village, Kyle placed a special medallion around his neck that marked him as a full adult member of the community with all the rights and responsibilities that came with that status. The celebration that followed lasted 3 days, and people came from neighboring villages to participate, and there was music and dancing and feasting, and Danny felt surrounded by love and acceptance in a way that made his heart feel almost too full. During the celebration, an old female elder named Tiva approached Danny, and she was one of the few villagers who still remembered the early days when Danny had first arrived as a frightened child, and she had been skeptical about allowing him to stay. "I was wrong about you," she said in the common language, "and I thought you would be a burden or a danger, but instead, you have been a blessing, and I am grateful that Kyle had the wisdom to welcome you when I did not." Danny embraced Tiva and thanked her for her honesty, and he told her that he understood her initial concerns and that he was grateful she had given him a chance to prove himself over time. As the months passed after his coming-of-age ceremony, Danny took on more and more leadership responsibilities, and he led hunting parties and mediated disputes and helped plan the expansion of the village's gardens and living spaces. Lyra also continued to grow in her role as a healer, and she had become so skilled that people would travel for days to seek her treatment, and her reputation spread far beyond their immediate region. One day a messenger arrived from a distant village with urgent news, and they reported that a strange sickness was spreading through their community, and none of their healers knew how to treat it, and they had heard of Lyra's skill and were begging for her help. Lyra immediately began preparing to make the journey, and she gathered her medicines and tools, and Danny insisted on accompanying her because the journey would be dangerous and she should not travel alone. Cale gave them his blessing and assigned 2 experienced hunters to travel with them for protection, and the group set out at dawn heading toward the afflicted village, which was located almost a week's journey to the north. The journey took them through parts of the forest that Danny had never seen before, and they crossed rivers on makeshift rafts and climbed through rocky terrain and navigated dense undergrowth that seemed almost impenetrable. Along the way, they encountered various challenges, including aggressive wildlife and a severe storm that forced them to take shelter for an entire day, and a rope bridge that had partially collapsed and needed to be repaired before they could cross. Danny's skills as an engineer and problem solver proved invaluable during these challenges, and he helped design a safe way to cross the damaged bridge and figured out how to construct a better shelter during the storm. When they finally reached the afflicted village, Danny was shocked by what he saw, and the settlement was in terrible condition with sick people lying everywhere, and the healthy villagers were exhausted from caring for the ill, and they looked desperate and afraid. Lyra immediately went to work examining patients and asking questions about symptoms and trying to understand what they were dealing with, and she worked tirelessly for hours talking to healers and studying the sick and searching for patterns. Danny helped by organizing the healthy villagers into teams to provide basic care and ensure everyone had clean water and food, and he also worked on improving the sanitation conditions, which he suspected might be contributing to the spread of the disease. After 2 days of intense investigation, Lyra made a breakthrough, and she realized that the sickness was being caused by contaminated water from an upstream source that had become polluted, and once she understood the cause, she knew how to treat it. She prepared medicines to help the sick recover faster, and she worked with Danny to find a new clean water source for the village and to establish systems to prevent future contamination. Over the next week, the sick began to recover, and the crisis passed, and the village leader was so grateful that he offered Lyra and Danny anything they wanted as payment, but Lyra refused, saying that helping others was its own reward. However, she did accept a gift of rare medicinal plants that grew only in that region, and she also established a friendship with the village healers and promised to share knowledge and stay in contact. The journey back to their own village was much more relaxed, and the group traveled slowly, enjoying the beauty of the forest and stopping to gather interesting plants and materials along the way. When they finally arrived home, they were greeted as heroes, and the story of how they had saved an entire village spread quickly and added to their growing reputations. Cale pulled Danny aside after the welcome celebration and spoke to him seriously about the future, and he said that the time was coming when he would need to step down as village leader, and that he wanted Danny to be ready to take his place. "I know this is a great responsibility," Cale said, "and I know that some may question whether a human should lead our people, but I have watched you grow and learn, and I know that you have the wisdom and compassion and strength that a good leader needs." Danny felt the weight of this expectation, but he also felt ready, and he had spent years learning from Cale and from the other elders, and he understood the values and traditions that guided the village. "I will do my best to honor your trust," Danny said, "and I will lead with the same wisdom and fairness that you have shown. And I will work to keep building bridges between different communities and different ways of thinking." The seasons continued their cycle, and Danny and Lyra both continued to grow in their respective roles, and they remained as close as ever, and their bond was a source of strength for both of them. The village prospered, and the population grew, and new platforms were built higher in the canopy to accommodate the expanding community, and trade relationships with other settlements became stronger and more frequent. Danny developed a reputation throughout the region as a wise and fair mediator, and villages would sometimes ask him to help resolve disputes or provide advice on difficult problems. He traveled extensively, learning about different communities and their unique challenges and solutions, and everywhere he went, he worked to build connections and foster understanding between groups. Lyra established a network of healers across multiple villages, and they would meet regularly to share knowledge and techniques, and this collaboration led to significant advances in medical treatment and care. Together, Danny and Lyra represented a new kind of leadership that valued cooperation over competition and knowledge sharing over hoarding secrets, and their approach was slowly changing the culture of the entire region. When Danny was 20, Cale officially retired as village leader, And in a solemn ceremony, he passed the leadership medallion to Danny, and the village affirmed their support for this transition. Some of the older villagers had reservations about a human leader, but they respected Cale's judgment and they had seen Danny's dedication and capability over many years, so they gave him their tentative support. Danny's first act as leader was to establish a council of advisors that included people of all ages and backgrounds, and he made sure that multiple perspectives were always considered when making important decisions. He also created new systems for teaching children both practical skills and cultural knowledge, and he emphasized the importance of understanding and respecting both human and native traditions. Lyra continued her work as the village's chief healer, but she also took on a role as Danny's closest advisor, and they worked together to guide the community through challenges and opportunities. The village under Danny's leadership became known as a place of innovation and cooperation, and people from distant settlements would come to learn about their methods and systems. Danny never forgot that he was a bridge between two worlds, and he worked constantly to honor both his human heritage and his adopted culture, and to help others see that differences could be sources of strength rather than division. On quiet evenings, he would still climb to the highest platform and look up at the stars and think about the journey that had brought him here, and about his parents who had sacrificed themselves to save him, and about the twist of fate that had led him to Lyra and to this village and to this life. He knew now that he would never leave this place and that he would spend the rest of his life working to make it better, and to help build a future where humans and natives could live together in harmony and mutual respect. Years passed and Danny grew into his role as village leader with increasing confidence and skill, and under his guidance the community continued to thrive and expand, and become a model for how different peoples could live together in harmony. The village that had once been home to 300 natives now housed over 500 individuals, and this included not just the original inhabitants and their descendants, but also a small number of refugees from other settlements who had heard about the welcoming culture and come seeking a better life. Danny had never encountered another human being since the crash of the Horizon's dawn, and sometimes he wondered if he truly was the last of his kind on this entire planet. But he had long ago made peace with this possibility, because his family was here, and his home was here, and his purpose was here. Lyra remained his closest friend and advisor, and their bond had only deepened over the years, and they understood each other in ways that went beyond words, and they could work together seamlessly, whether they were solving a community crisis or just sharing a quiet moment watching the sunset. She had never married, and when others asked her why, she would simply say that her work as a healer kept her too busy for such things, but Danny sometimes wondered if there was more to it than that, and if perhaps she felt the same way he did about their unique and irreplaceable connection. The innovations that Danny and the village had pioneered continued to spread throughout the region, and other communities adopted their methods for agriculture and water management and conflict resolution, and this created a network of villages that were more prosperous and stable than they had been before. Danny established a formal system of education where young people from different villages could come to learn various skills and trades, and this created new connections between communities and helped spread knowledge and understanding across cultural boundaries. One day when Danny was 25, a young hunter came running into the village shouting that he had seen something impossible in the forest, and everyone gathered around to hear his story. The hunter claimed that he had seen a structure made of metal in a clearing about 2 days' journey to the west, and it was unlike anything built by their people, and it had strange markings on it that he could not read, and there was a blinking light on one side. Danny's heart stopped, and he immediately knew what the hunter had found, and it was another escape pod from the Horizon's dawn, and if there was a blinking light, then maybe, just maybe, someone else had survived. He gathered supplies in a small group of experienced hunters, and they set out immediately toward the location the young hunter had described, and Danny's mind raced with possibilities and hopes and fears about what they might find. The journey seemed to take forever, even though they traveled as quickly as they could, and Danny could barely sleep at night because he was so anxious about what awaited them. When they finally reached the clearing, Danny saw the escape pod half buried in the undergrowth, and it was partially covered with vines and clearly had been there for many years, and the emergency beacon was still blinking weakly. Danny approached slowly, and his hands were shaking as he cleared away the vines and found the hatch, and it was sealed shut from the inside, which meant that someone had survived the landing. He called out in English asking if anyone was there, but There was no response, and he worked to open the hatch using tools he had brought, and finally, after much effort, the seal broke, and the hatch swung open. Inside the pod was empty except for scattered supplies and a survival pack similar to the one Danny had carried. And on the wall were scratched markings that appeared to be a record of days, and Danny counted them and realized this survivor had lived in the pod for almost 3 months before leaving. There was also a message scratched into the metal in English, and it said, "Going north to find higher ground and look for others." And Danny felt a surge of hope because this person had survived and had left the pod and might still be alive somewhere. He studied the clearing and the surrounding forest, looking for any signs of which direction the survivor had gone. And he found faint traces of an old trail heading northeast, and he knew they had to follow it. The group traveled for another week, following the faint trail and asking at villages they passed if anyone had seen a strange being like Danny. And finally, at a small settlement near the edge of a great plain, they got the answer they were seeking. "Yes," an old male villager said, "and we saw such a being many seasons ago, and she was injured and sick, and we tried to help her. But she died after only a few days, and we buried her at the edge of our territory." Danny felt his heart sink, and he asked to be taken to the grave. And the villager led them to a small clearing where a simple marker stood, and Danny knelt beside it and wept for this person he had never known, and for the loneliness she must have felt, and for the cruel twist of fate that had brought her so close to another human, but not close enough. The villager explained that the woman had been badly injured in her crash and had developed an infection that their healers could not cure, and she had been delirious near the end, speaking in a language they could not understand. Danny thanked the villagers for their kindness in trying to help her and for giving her a proper burial, and he spent the night beside the grave talking to this unknown woman and telling her about his life and his village and how he wished they could have met. In the morning, Danny and his group began the long journey home, and he carried with him the knowledge that he was truly alone now, and that he was the only human on New Terra as far as he knew. But as they traveled back through the forest, Danny realized that he was not really alone, and he had a family and a community and a purpose, and he had built a life that was rich and meaningful, even if it was not the life he had been born to live. When they returned to the village, Lyra was waiting at the entrance, and she saw Danny's face and understood immediately what he had found and what he had lost, and she wrapped all 4 of her arms around him and held him while he cried. That night, as they sat together on their favorite platform, Lyra said something that Danny would remember for the rest of his life, and she said, "You may be the only one of your kind here, but you are not alone, because you have us, and we have you, and family is not about where you come from, but about who chooses to stand beside you." Danny realized she was right, and he had spent so many years building bridges and fostering connections and creating a blended culture that honored both his human heritage and his adopted home. The village continued to grow and prosper, and children were born who grew up hearing stories about Danny the human, who had fallen from the sky and saved Lyra, and brought new knowledge and new ways of thinking to their people. These children learned to speak both languages, and they played games from both cultures, and they saw no contradiction in honoring multiple traditions, because Danny and Lyra had shown them that differences could be celebrated rather than feared. Years turned into decades, and Danny grew older, and his hair turned gray, and his face gained lines, and he moved a bit slower than he once had, but his mind remained sharp, and his commitment to his community never wavered. Lyra also aged, and her silver skin gained the patterns that marked wisdom and experience, and she trained a new generation of healers who carried on her methods and her philosophy of care. When Danny was 50 years old, he stood on the highest platform at sunset and looked out over the village that had grown so much since he had first arrived as a frightened 10-year-old boy. He could see platforms extending far into the canopy, in all directions, and he could hear the sounds of hundreds of people going about their evening routines, and he could see the gardens flourishing and the children playing. Lyra joined him as she always did, and they stood together in comfortable silence, and Danny thought about the journey that had brought him here, and about all the choices and chances and moments that had led to this life. He thought about his parents, and how they had sacrificed everything to save him, and he hoped that somehow they knew that their sacrifice had not been in vain, and that he had not just survived, but had thrived, and had built something meaningful. He thought about the woman whose grave he had found, and how different his life might have been if he had found her alive, and if they had tried to build a human colony together. But he realized that this life, the one he had actually lived, was the one he would choose. "What are you thinking about?" Lyra asked, and they were speaking her language because some thoughts felt more natural in certain tongues. "I am thinking about home," Danny said, "and about how I lost one home but found another, and about how sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best things in our lives." "The threads of fate," Lyra said, and she had said this same thing many times over the years, and they tangled and brought you to us and brought us to you. And now we are all woven together. Danny took her hand, and they watched as the orange sun set. Behind the purple trees and the bioluminescent insects began their nightly dance, and the village lit up with warm light from cooking fires and glowing organisms. This was home, and these were his people, and this was the life he had built from the ashes of tragedy and loss, and he knew that when his time came, and he took his final breath, he would die knowing that he had made a difference. He had shown that compassion could cross the void between species, and that family could be chosen, and that home could be.